Now, the FIA found itself under a lot of scrutiny recently, and in Brazil there were quite some questionable calls that might have to change sooner rather than later, and they don't revolve solely around Verstappen's driving style. For example, the governing body has dished out penalties that the teams felt were too harsh, and with the aborted start reaction from Norris and the others who followed him, it was also interesting to see how they've dealt with the entire situation. But with the governing body now under massive pressure from Verstappen and the GPDA, can they change something to make racing more entertaining? Or will they continue with these shenanigans and continue to promote themselves as the laughingstock of the sport? It goes without saying that the FIA has made some questionable calls to say the least. And one of the most important ones was the virtual safety car in the sprint race, as well as the red flags during qualifying. Let's start with the virtual safety car, as Hülkenberg was out of the car at Sector 2 for quite some time, but the race director did nothing until the McLaren cars swapped positions. Yes, waving the yellow flag was enough to show the cars that there is a potential hazard on the track. But once they saw that the Haas isn't moving and Hülkenberg is out of it, the virtual or full safety car should have been out immediately. Instead, they waited for the McLaren cars to swap positions and immediately called the virtual safety car, which was a bit too obvious. It's not just Verstappen, but Lawson himself called the move unbelievable, and the timing of it questionable to say the least. But this is just the beginning of things. Throughout the virtual safety car, Verstappen tried to gain a bit of advantage on Piastri and has gone side by side with the Australian. Hence, he was penalised 5 seconds and 1 penalty point on his super licence, which was, speaking honestly, a proper move to do because Verstappen should have known better. He's the driver who forced the FIA to bring this rule after the 2021 Abu Dhabi restart. But after that, through qualifying, there were a lot of questionable decisions by the FIA, and it seems like all of them have aggravated the fans to a breaking point. Red flags were to be expected during wet weather conditions, and while they were called almost immediately once the cars had crashed, a very interesting scenario happened with Lance Stroll's crash in Q2. The car was still moving, and while it was obvious that he couldn't drive it with a broken rear wing, which calls for a red flag action immediately, or at least double yellows, they waited for 5 drivers to finish their laps and then to call the red flag, which is a delay of 40 seconds. For example, it didn't take longer than 10 seconds to apply the red flag when drivers like Alonso and Sainz have gone into the wall. And according to the FIA, this was because they believed Stroll could get out of the situation he found himself in, which again is no excuse because the car was damaged beyond repair and it's illegal to drive it as such to the pit lane. Elaborating on the situation to a greater extent, the FIA went on to say that while he was stationary in the runoff area on the exit of a corner where several other drivers had spun or crashed, the governing body was satisfied to stay under double wave yellow flag conditions until then because it effectively acted as a local red flag, with drivers required to stop on the scene of the accident. This would automatically mean that their lap times would have ruined anyways, as there was no place for improvement. But according to Horner, the safety of the drivers has been brought under a huge question mark by this move of the FIA, which saw Verstappen disqualified from Q2 at P12, and with a 5-place grid penalty, it effectively meant he would start the race at P17. Luckily for him, 3 of the drivers ahead have decided to either not start the race or start it from the pit lane, which meant that he was more or less P14, even though the slots had remained empty for Albon and Stroll, who spun out of the formation lap and failed to recover the car to the start-finish line. When talking about the situation, Horner said, "I don't understand why it took so long for the red flag to come out. It's obviously a big accident. Turn 3 and one of the most dangerous corners on the circuit. It took 40 seconds to throw the red flag, and it's the second day in the row now that we've had very late calls. Whether it was a virtual safety car yesterday or the red flag today, the other red flags were all instantaneous. All you've got to do is focus on the safety. It's not about letting cars finish laps. You've got cars coming through and you can't say, oh well, we'll just wait for the others to finish their laps. It doesn't work like that. And I know that David Croft from Sky 1 was endorsing that, but Lance Stroll was not trying to get that car going again. It hit the barrier hard. It was in the middle of the track at turn 3. That's an immediate red flag." Now, the same narrative was shared by Verstappen as well, who went on to say, "If a guy goes straight into the wall, it's a straight red. I don't understand why you need to take 30-40 seconds for a red flag to come out. I don't care about some of the drivers who are allowed to finish their laps, in all honesty. It's so stupid to talk about. It's ridiculous." Now, regarding Stroll, he did cause more headache for the FIA because he failed to return the car to the start-finish line as he spun yet again and beached the car while he could have easily followed the tarmac path and brought himself back to where he belongs. But with Stroll being Stroll, these things can be expected from the Canadian driver. On the other hand, he caused an aborted start situation in which the cars are supposed to stand still and wait for further instructions from the race control. But Norris has voluntarily decided that he would start yet another formation lap, and the others followed him as they had no other choice. This is also something that caused a big stir up in the Formula 1 world regarding the FIA's maneuvers of handling the race the way they're supposed to. And while they did admit that Norris and Russell were at fault for doing so as they received their penalties, it's merely financial and nothing that would hurt their championships in general. Apart from them, several other teams were simultaneously penalised, but to be fair, once Norris has gone into the dust, the others didn't really have a choice, and the penalty for Norris was €5,000 and a reprimand. A driver is supposed to get 4 per season, with the 5th one resulting in a 10-place grid penalty. In an official letter, the FIA explained why the penalty was given to Norris when a similar situation happened back in Monza 2023 when Tsunoda was unable to make it to the start-finish line. And with a similar message on the board, the drivers have still committed to one more formation lap with a safety car ahead of them. As the letter wrote, although the signal was appropriately given with the light panel illuminated as prescribed and the teams notified by the messaging system, the driver left the grid and proceeded on a lap that he assumed to be an extra formation lap. As the driver was on the front row of the grid, this triggered the following drivers to take similar action. At some point, the race director, realizing that for practical reasons, all cars will now need to do an extra formation lap, gave an instruction to the teams for all cars to proceed and return to the grid to follow the correct aborted start procedure. This is something that was noted by Max Verstappen, who was complimented by his race engineer Lambiase, as before Max went on the formation lap, he asked why they were doing it in the first place when the instructions were clear, an aborted lap. And then there were a couple of 10-second penalties that were given to drivers who quite frankly didn't really deserve it at this harsh degree because it ruined the race for them. In the narrow second sector of the race, Behrman and Colapinto made contact as the Haas driver touched the Williams driver from the back, and while it was a dangerous move, Colapinto didn't lose anything from it. It was Behrman who lost a position or two after it. Nevertheless, the FIA labelled this as dangerous driving and handed the man who replaced Magnussen a 10-second penalty, to which Behrman responded, "It was a tough race, too many mistakes from my side, and that really compromised our race. I think on one side we finished P12 quite close to the point, despite the amount of mistakes I made. On the other side, too many mistakes, too many time losses, and stuff like that. It was a really tough day. I learnt a lot, that's for sure, for the next time." Piastri has received a 10-second penalty as well, but his one was quite deserving as he tried to complete a dive from the inside and that failed miserably, spinning Lawson and ultimately ruining his race. Eventually the Aussie did finish ahead of the Kiwi driver, but had it not been for this aggressive move, maybe we would have seen Lawson add 2 more points to his name and make the battle with Haas even spicier for P6 in the Constructors' Championship. So with all this in mind, do you think that the FIA has gone too far with the penalties? And more importantly, do you think that the red flag of Stroll and the virtual safety car of Hülkenberg have been 2 of the darkest points of the race? Let us know in the comments down below.